Hello, everybody. It is the October 2nd, 2025 SIG Arch call. I think all of our official chairs are out of office or joining late, so you get unofficial hosts like me. We have a few things on the agenda, and I will go ahead and hand it over to Rob for the first one if he is on the call, which
I think
he
Rob's out of office.
is not. Cool. Maybe I will put that back into the future agenda
Man,
items.
I was stoked about that one.
Yeah, I want a link. Like you can't just put this isn't sufficient. And I want a link to understand like what they're trying to do. And yeah.
Yeah, Rob is out.
Okay. All right.
Just check.
We'll move that back to the future. So Sergey.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring this topic because it will probably break some compatibility. I really hope that we can do that, but maybe we cannot. So we've been discussing this new features on the SIG node and how they support Windows. We have a lot of features coming in the pipeline that as a starting point don't support Windows for a while. And I don't know when SIG Windows will decide to pick them up. The history doesn't show like a very active development there, so maybe soon, maybe never. And based on this, we want to make sure that customer experience is the best we can offer. Right now, the experience we will probably have is we will try to do validation on API side based on spec OS name, and we probably will do like a kubelet admission controller to so for pods that didn't have the OS name set up on the beginning, we will fail admission of these pods. But this is not ideal, and we've been discussing in the doc whether we can do some sort of defaulting on API server or change the long-standing assumption about API that OS spec name doesn't have any defaults and you shouldn't assume any. So like first option we have is written in this document is whenever new feature is used by pod, we will force upgrade the OS name to Linux. So this is the first option. Second option we had is to just keep status quo and like don't change anything, don't default to anything. We just have user experience to be like API validation doing its best, but then another validation will happen on kubelet side. And third option that I'm bringing up here is whether we can change this long-standing default saying that if there is no OS spec name, then just assume Linux. And this will break some compatibility, but at the same time, I wonder how big this breakage is and like whether we can just make a loud announcement about it and make user experience better. So nobody will need to force default OS name or like there will be no APIs that defaulting it for you. So yeah, that's basically a proposal to change the assumption that default means Linux.
I think you described three possibilities, which was default, the OS
spec name to Linux if new feature is used.
The Linux feature is used. The second was
make a validation on admission controller and like on pod on kubelet admission.
Okay, so kubelet admission to reject pods using features unsupported by the OS.
This is basically a status quo, right?
Yeah. And last one is assume default of OS name to be Linux. Don't override it, but assume it's Linux if it's not set.
We don't have a way to explicitly request multi-OS or OS agnostic. So I think we would need to add an explicit value for that as well. for the third action?
I'll note that even if you set the OS name to Linux, that does not inform scheduling. That pod can still be scheduled to any node. And the kubelet, it's a kubelet admission check whether the kubelet can honor that pod OS. Because there is the possibility of a Windows node running Linux pods inside like a Linux VM on the node. So the OS is the OS of the pod. It's not saying I should only go to a node with this OS. So even if we defaulted the OS name to Linux, those, like if you didn't mess with any of the scheduling, the node, selector affinity, if you didn't mess with any of the scheduling directives, those pods would still be able to be scheduled to Windows nodes, and they would be rejected currently at kubelet admission time by a Windows kubelet. So from a user experience perspective, it would still get rejected at kubelet admission time.
Yeah, I did want to add too, I just checked, and on the Kates.io website docs for Windows, we do recommend setting, actually we say the spec.os.name field should be set to Windows to indicate the current pod uses Windows containers. Yep. And we do also say for scheduling, recommend or strongly recommend using a node selector for Kubernetes.io/OS.
Aside from what's theoretically possible with the API, are there any implementations of like the node is one OS but the pod is another OS in the ecosystem? Maybe something like KubeVirt. Because I think
likely is Linux, right?
Yeah, because I don't know. I feel like that to a certain extent, this also is just like a confusing corner of the API. I forgot about this field when I'm using Linux containers. I'm not using this, and if I need to do node scheduling, I'm thinking like selectors.
Yeah, while it's technically supported and like running Linux containers on Windows is a pretty common scenario for like development and for desktop usage. And I think it's technically supported and like possible. I don't think anybody does that in practice. I'm not aware of anybody who does that in practice. And I have not seen any requests for anybody to be able to do that in practice as well, too. So I'll say that.
Tim, you had a hand.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're aware of any like infrastructure workloads that are multi-OS, because I know you can have a Docker manifest that has like a Windows version and a Linux version. Are there pods that are explicitly like agnostic to which OS they land on?
I mean, most pods are like all of the CSI drivers and stuff. There's like a single spec, like single pod spec that you deploy as a daemon set. It's a Windows node. It runs Windows containers, and if it lands on a Linux node, it's a Linux container. And there's like a lot of like not sure. I think the CNIs specify most CNIs specify different container names, but things like all of the CSI driver pods definitely are just like a single pod spec. Then just picks the containers in the like depending on what node it lands on. So I would say that's a pretty common scenario. And same with that's how a lot of the EDE tests run too. There's Windows and Linux flavors. And for the tests that aren't marked Linux only, we just schedule the EDE test pods on a node. And if it hits a Windows node, we run the Windows flavor. And we've set it up so that like everything in BusyBox and like all the commands in BusyBox run on Windows. They like get linked to Windows implementations or like a PowerShell like adapter that runs the same commands, but that's pretty common.
So those would all be broken by a change to the default behavior then.
Yeah, I was gonna ask what exactly you meant by infrastructure pods, like people's cluster operations. as opposed to workloads? Because I don't I don't think it's super common with workloads, but like we have gone way out of our way to make sure that we're doing that for the test pods. And we know that at least a few things in the project are capable, like CNI or CSI.
Yep.
I'm trying to take notes, but I'm also falling behind. So if you want to revisit and like fill in some of the examples that you mentioned, I don't think I grabbed them. I don't know if hands were for,
Yeah.
I don't know. It was either Sergey or David. I don't know.
I think David was next, but
Sure. So I had a comment on the first possibility, default the OS name to Linux if a Linux feature is used. If I'm understanding that correctly, and I want to play out what would happen if I added feature awesome. So I add feature awesome and, well, Linux is best, so it gets it first. But in 2 releases afterward, 3 releases afterward, we actually go ahead and add feature awesome to Windows pods as well, because it's that awesome. Does this mean that a manifest that someone used for the first 3 releases would suddenly behave differently? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I'm not in favor of this first possibility, because I think it ends up trapping future us in a way that actually makes it even harder to add parity.
Yeah, I agree with that. Anything we do in the moment, because like a given feature is only supported at a point in time on Linux, but it's not like fundamentally Linux only, like, inferring that for all time use of this feature means Linux isn't correct. Like it's a point in time statement. So I don't think we should default just because Windows support doesn't exist yet. What I would advocate for is for new features which are only supported on particular OSs, require OS name to be set to one of the supported OSs. And then in the future, if support from more OSs is added for that feature, we can broaden what we accept. I think the effect will likely be that pretty much everything will start setting OS name Linux to use new features, which for the time being are Linux only. But that's at least compatible in the future. When Windows support is added, they can, they keep behaving the way they did. And if they want to take advantage of the multi-OS new support, then they can target Windows, or they can, I guess, at the point when all the values are, all the OSs are supported, they could drop the field.
Would we
It's
choose
ugly,
drop,
but
or would we choose any? I think any is a safer choice.
any is the implicit default.
So
for
once
no-
you required it to be set once, removing it seems stranger than allowing it to be any to me.
Sergey, were you reacting to this or a different topic? Because I have comments
He
for
had
this,
his
but
hand
you've had
up.
your hand up, so
kind of overall, but like you can react on this one if you want.
why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm trying to rehash this mixed workload and like this philosophy of all OSs born equal. Like we're trying to optimize for like we're trying to pretend that containers will run the same way on Linux and Windows, but like even for the CSI drivers, I wonder how much of it is true that proper requests and limits will work the same way and need to be set the same way on Linux and Windows. Maybe we just don't set any requests and limits to optimize it to work on both and pretend it works on both when in reality you should have thought very carefully and have different specs for both containers. or like both pods. So I'm trying to poke on this idea that you can do the same thing on both operating systems, and you don't need to think about it unless you like have a specific feature. So I feel like splitting it explicitly now may be a good idea. So in future, everybody will know that which one they building for.
We have existing generic opaque ways to steer workloads towards particular nodes and to sort of fence off nodes so that workloads have to explicitly tolerate them, right? We have the OS selector in node selector, and we have the ability to taint node pools to say, this is a Windows node pool. Unless you meant to go here, you probably shouldn't go here. But those are opaque and sort of depend on, well, maybe not the OS selector, but like that's sort of up to particular installations to fence off node pools.
Yeah, but
trying to combine those generic things with inferring stuff like in API defaulting, I think is going to be really hard. We don't know how people set up their clusters to be successful today. And so taking those existing successful setups and saying, oh, we're going to assume you meant Linux will definitely break some people who are working today. All right,
so I don't know if we should be defaulting, but I also don't think it's a good answer to say everybody needs to put like OS named Linux on their pods left and right to use features. I think what Sergey was trying to get at is that I don't think it's very realistic if you look around the ecosystem that people are just casually having a pod and like, oh, whoops, now it's running on Windows because I added some Windows nodes to the cluster. You have to be very intentional about this. Linux and Windows containers are almost totally unrelated concepts, and there are not going to be a lot of applications that you just interchangeably run on those. I think overwhelmingly the use case in the ecosystem is I need to run a Windows application, so I want to have some Windows nodes in my cluster to run a Windows application. It might be true that some exist, but it feels bad if we optimize for okay, everyone needs to opt their pods into explicitly declaring Linux to use things when that is like most pods. So it sounds like today you don't have to. I think we should try to find an outcome where we shouldn't do the automatic defaulting of the field, but I also don't think we should start saying in order to use Linux features you have to set this field, because that just becomes noise on the majority of pods, and maybe it's a little bit better for us, but that's kind of crappy for users. I don't think many pods are just, oh, throw it at any you can do it. I mean, you have to even know Windows containers have to be built against the host OS version.
Yeah,
so like those fat manifests, they don't just work. Like Linux containers generally should work on most kernels and most hosts, but when we build the fat manifests for something like pause, we have to actually add each new like what is it, but like biannual version of Windows to those, because the user space has to come with. So you have to be pretty intentional
That's no
about
longer
matching them
true.
up.
I just want to do a quick
Okay.
interjection. That's no longer true. Starting with Windows Server 2025, which is released, there is backwards compatibility with that too. So any like Windows Server 2025 will run any container that's targeted against Windows Server 2022 and Windows Server 2025. The next version of Windows Server will run all of the containers back. I think that they're supporting like the past 2 or 3 Windows Server versions, which is a good 8 to 10 year coverage. So that's no longer true, and that's like I don't even know if we've published a Windows pause image for that has the Windows Server 25 manifest, because we've just been running with the Windows Server 22 one. So that I don't know, that might change the equation. That was super annoying, and that was like a big pain point for Windows containers, and that did happen. And I do want to say too, in specifically in like the Python ecosystem, I've seen tons and tons of people just like all of the major Python based images do the multi-manifest also, and we have seen people put their Python applications on top of Windows, like on top of those and just throw it at a cluster and run. So I think there are some pockets of users that do not care as much, and so they're relying on that. But I think that's kind of minor. But I think the bigger one is the like the OS version compatibility no longer being required. I think might change the equation a little bit.
That's awesome. But do you think that users are widely depending on like fungibility of the OS with their workloads?
When I hear you say that, Ben, and I don't think you mean it this way, but it means
Yeah.
what I hear is the users that I support don't do that. And
No.
and that's like, because even if they're not a huge percentage of all Kubernetes users, they definitely exist, and I don't have any
I don't want
desire
to
to make a
break
change
them.
that,
Yes,
you know.
I'm not advocating for a change that breaks them, but I also think we should avoid a change that like de facto breaks the majority of users that you like, or not necessarily breaks, but degrades the user experience that you've got to add this extra bit of boilerplate to every pod. There's almost certainly a third option that doesn't require breaking these workloads, but also doesn't
So Jordan's idea
optimize for this
doesn't
uncommon use case.
So Jordan's idea is there's a new feature, and I'm going to adjust my manifest to use this new feature. And as I do so, I also have to indicate the OS that I want to run on so that I can be sure that I create a pod that will actually run. And that seems like you're already in the manifest. You're already changing it. You're already making a change. We're not making something that previously worked and saying, hey, you have to go add this field. We're saying, like, okay, you want to go leverage this new feature? Well, you should be aware, you have to be aware that this only works on Linux when you do it.
But if you do something like in-place pod resize, you're not actually doing that like when you're editing a pod manifest, right? Like that's something you're doing in the cluster that could target mini pods. So now you need to go update all of your pods to set this so that you can leverage this feature. That's where I think that it might not be great if the answer is you need to set this field on all your pods.
In-place resize is a little bit of a different thing because that happens generally after you're already bound to a node. So we actually could enforce that in admission based on what node you're running on.
And there's actually, we already have cases where like you want to resize the pod, but you can't. And there's a path for the node, like you can indicate, oh yeah, you tried to resize this pod and it didn't take for some reason. Maybe because the node you're on doesn't support it because it's Windows, or maybe because it doesn't have resources for it. Like there was one other possibility, which is the tainting of node pools. Like if it sounds like we're trying to make it possible for people to take manifests, sort of generic manifests, and ship them to any cluster and have them work. And for that to work, either the manifest has to fully specify, like I'm assuming Linux, but I actually need to have a node selector that like selects Linux to make sure. But people don't do that. They assume Linux. They assume things that are standard in their existing environment, and that they don't think about that they might be different in other environments. So they either have to fully specify the manifest, which means putting a node selector or putting an OS name or like just make everything explicit, or the environment needs to sort of taint nodes that are unusual or uncommon or unexpected in some way. And so if the majority of manifests are assuming Linux, then maybe that means tainting Windows node pools in some way so that only manifests that tolerated it would get steered to a Windows node. There's no standard taint or like well-known taint for that. Maybe that's a path to, like, if we document it, we recommend doing this. So if you are fine running on Windows, like tolerate this well-known taint. And if you go into a cluster that doesn't use that, no harm, no foul. If you go into a cluster that does use it, then great. you interoperate with that. Maybe that's a path to consider.
That's also sort of a de facto breaking change, though, at least from the point of the people developing the like ecosystem workloads.
No, you can tolerate taints that don't exist in a particular cluster without any impact.
But they have to add that toleration.
Adding a toleration is fine. Adding the taint would be the breaking change. If you want to add it to your environment.
Sure, but if we recommend that people start setting this taint, then all those Python examples, for example, will kind of need to be updated.
All right, Tim. I can't keep track of hands. I don't know who's first. I'm sorry.
I think I'm up.
Okay.
What I was going to say, so we're developing node declared features to handle heterogeneous cluster scheduling for new feature rollout. When we were discussing it, we explicitly ruled out kind of Windows support from it because it's not necessarily something that is time bound. And so node declare features are supposed to be temporary. But the infrastructure that we're building for that, the library of like figuring out which nodes are compatible with which features on the pod, seems like something that we could potentially leverage here. Like you could just have basically like a virtual node declared feature that's the OS and kind of derive OS requirements from the pod spec and use that to handle the routing.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention is, you want to react on this?
Yeah, the time requirement for that was what I was sticking on. I was thinking about that as well. Like if if Windows never adds support for a feature, like having to have the mapping from if this field is set, then only this set of node operating systems is supported forever. Like the forever bit is what I didn't match what we had talked about, like having to keep that mapping forever. And maybe with a sort of ever-growing number of feature mappings didn't seem like what we wanted to do.
Yeah, we also have OS spec name already. We just don't use it the way it's obvious for everybody. It's kind of pretend that everything is generic. So I wanted to bring up another use case. Like let's say I'm Istio developer and I want to inject this Istio sidecar while utilizing pod level resources. I think it will be quite natural for people in Istio to try to do that. There are many benefits why they will want to do pod level resources instead of individual resources on sidecar. So let's say they develop it, like they have no means to check the operating system. So now they either need to force the pod into being broken on Windows, or they need to never use this feature. So this binary is very complicated for them. That's why I don't know, like why is it so bad to just make it default to Linux? I don't see a lot of yeah. I cannot. I see a pain of some workloads that are very specific and like they have very specific environments, and I see the pain of all like common components implementers and all the like big majority of customers. And I want to weigh these two pain points, and maybe majority of customers should win.
I think if you add up, well, there's sort of three categories. One is people who are working today. Like people who are working today using an API service we said was stable, breaking that promise and saying, like, you integrated with a stable API surface, and then at some point in the future, we broke you. We should not do that. Like, I don't think that's acceptable to do. Just pretty much full stop. What we do for new features, like we have options for new features. Doing a principled, if we could know that a given feature would only ever be supported on Linux, then saying the presence of this feature implies, you know, you have an OS selector targeting Linux and you have an OS name of Linux. If it was only and forever going to be Linux, maybe that sort of defaulting would make sense. But if it's a point in time thing where it's right now, this is Linux, but there's no reason it can't be Windows. And if there's demand for it, we would add it to Windows. I don't think we can default to Linux now and change it later.
I definitely agree with that. And yeah, I do not have a desire to break people. I would say that if we want to default an empty OS field, that default should be any, because that's what that means today. And so a discussion of make the default Linux is really a case of let's change our existing default after many years. And we're going to do it because we think that the number of pods that exist there just aren't big enough to worry about. And I can't get behind that.
I don't think that's the extent of the reason to consider something like this. The other thing is that within the project, it's a relatively single vendor feature that's carried on the backs of just a few maintainers. We don't have adequate release signal, and it's difficult for contributors that are working on other areas to support, and it's not really good options to test it or verify that it's working. There's one release informing job that's currently broken. The unit tests are broken and not responded to, and we depend pretty heavily on Mark to handle basically everything. So that extends to things like that Istio developer that now can't leverage the work we've done for pod level resources. We don't want to break users, but I do think we need to think about how do we balance this and try to make it better for the well supported, really active multi-vendor parts of the ecosystem. Maybe not quite how I wanted to phrase that, but hopefully you get the gist.
Yeah, finding ways to improve the user experience, I think, are a good idea. I mean, the node capabilities stuff, not for Windows specific stuff, but for a long time, we've kind of had the posture of new features on new nodes. You try to use a feature and you've got old nodes, I guess you're just broken. That was a bad experience. And so, yeah, we should look for ways to improve user experience, but not at the cost of telling people, actually, we will break stuff that we told you was stable. So tainting node pools, well-known taints. If you intend to run on Windows, add this toleration, and something like that is the kind of thing that we could do gradually in a non-breaking way. And then once we get relative widespread penetration of that, tainting Windows node pools becomes a more safe thing. Those are the types of avenues I would look for, or an admission plugin that says, if you have a selector that says I want to go to Windows, maybe we could add a toleration for that well-known taint, things like that are non-breaking, while still improving the user experience. That's what I would hope to see.
Yeah, how do we come up with one that works for the Istios and things out there that are they don't outright own the cluster, but they want to leverage features and there's no way for them to know if they can use this feature since they technically have to support all, since that's the default. I think that digging into it, like maybe there's some version of like node of like feature discovery or something. I don't know. Maybe we can tell them they need to scan all the nodes in the cluster and see if there's any that would be impacted. But that I can't. It doesn't seem like we have a good answer for that, and so we wind up with these features are just not going to get used in the ecosystem unless maybe we do ship them to every platform as well first.
Yeah, we already have a sort of this problem with Sidecar. We waited for all releases to be GA and like a Sidecar feature being available before Istio can adopt it. And in this case, it will be like never, or like maybe Windows will in a year will support it. Like I don't know like when, and I don't know whether there is commitment from SIG Windows to support it, and it will be a recurrent problem.
I mean, the sidecar, like the injected changes to a pod spec that you aren't the primary owner of, that's like another layer of the thing. So the node capabilities would, for the next sidecar feature, if you injected a sidecar v2 into a pod, the node capabilities thing would keep that pod from being scheduled to old nodes, which on the one hand is good. That's a better user experience. On the other hand, maybe your injector just made 3/4 of your cluster capacity like unused. Like if you inject things into every pod. So whether an injector knows enough to know whether they should mess with a pod in a way that's going to disqualify from stuff, that's like a whole other dimension. I think they have to know all the nodes in your cluster sort of at that point. I would be happy if we just got to the point where people writing generic manifests could have a better expectation that they work in most clusters, and like have guidance for people who write manifests and guidance for people who run clusters to make user experience better in non-breaking ways. So things you can add to your manifest that won't hurt if you go to a existing cluster today, but will help if you go to a cluster that's following guidance we come up with, and guidance for cluster owners to say, here's how you can shape your cluster so that it will work better with just random manifests that people didn't consider stuff about your special cluster. We've spent a fair amount of time on this. I do want to give time to the last topic, but hopefully this at least was helpful in like listing out options, or maybe options we hadn't fully thought through. But I do want to go on to the next topic. So it's another deprecation possible breaking change topic. I don't know who wants to take point on this.
Yeah, I can start. So to give some context, what happened maybe a few weeks ago is we were finding that in the Fedora lanes for cryo and upstream Kubernetes, that what we thought was actually cgroups 1, it was silently creating a cgroups v2 node for a while. We tried to undo the change or basically fix it, and then we found that there was a lot of regressions in booting up a cgroups v1 node. I think we were missing a CPU set cgroup controller on cgroups v1, and generally the appetite for fixing cgroups v1 related features in the Fedora kernel ecosystem is pretty much nil at this point. So we figured for the cryo side, we remove the cgroup v1 lanes, and I thought it would be useful to kind of start this process of actually formally. I originally wanted to try to deprecate cgroups v1 and start doing the next step of the cgroup, basically trying to get people off of cgroups v1. And sorry, the other item that I saw was that System D258, which just came out 2 weeks ago, has announced that they removed the cgroups v1 code. So for us, for Fedora 43, we'll probably be using that. So we probably won't be able to actually test this on the latest upstream of Fedora. So David, I'll let you go.
I want to see if I understand the scope. So it sounds to me as though one particular OS had an accident. One particular, so Kubelet maybe had an accident. No, it sounds like one OS. Sounds like one OS had a problem. And rather than fix the problem, the OS said, we're done with that. And that seems like a fair choice for an OS to make. I'm not clear on why that would ripple up and have the capability removed from Kubelet for all OSs.
I guess the question, part of what I am finding is that we rely, like our upstream testing doesn't really pin our operating systems. So like we are kind of hitting a point where we either have to kind of take, like systemd is removing it in there in cgroups v1. So like if we want to actually support testing it, then we have to kind of figure out a way to maintain.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time following the we's and the its. Was we in that sense? Because we are also Fedora. So
sorry, Kubernetes. Generally, like I'm not sure how much commitment we are taking to maintain the cgroups v1 lanes for Kubernetes, and how, like, do we pick OSs that we know still work with cgroups v1 and maintain those until we are ready to remove cgroups v1 from Kubernetes?
Okay. So I guess from my point of view, similar to the Windows discussion, like even though I might say, well, I obviously care most about Fedora, screw everybody else. It's not obvious to me that this should force the decision for the kubelet. I'm okay with that happening, but I don't think I would use the Fedora removal as a reason to do the remove. I would use some other reason. I don't know offhand what that reason would be.
So if systemd removes the cgroups v1 code, is that not a big enough reason?
We know there are distros that don't use systemd that are like certified conformant.
Right. Like if you think about how do people run Kubernetes, there's, they run it on a variety of operating systems with a variety of init systems and a variety of tooling. When the first operating system and init system drops cgroup v1 support, like, does that mean Kubernetes should as well? It's like, oh, a first one, maybe a big one, dropped it. Therefore, Kubernetes should drop it at this point. Should we drop it when the first OS init system drops support, or when the last one drops support? Like those are the ends of the spectrum. Once no OS and no init system support it, there's no point. At that point, we could drop it and we don't impact anybody, presumably. It sounds like this is saying the first big one is dropping it, therefore we should drop it now too. And I mean, in general, the expectation is as long as there are people still depending on it, and as long as it's the cost on us is bearable, we just leave it. And I linked to the announcement on, like, in 131, we announced it in maintenance mode. So we've already said we're not adding features to it. We're not going to change it. If the things under us, like if the OS that you're running Kubernetes on broke cgroups v1 in some way, like that's a bug. They should probably go fix that. If you notice that it impacts you, like go yell at your OS vendor, or yell at the people who are changing things and breaking things for cgroups v1 in your use case. So for Fedora, maybe it sounds like it's broken. If you're using Fedora, you should probably go make noise, or decide to go to cgroups v2, or decide to go to another OS. That seems like an okay outcome to me.
Earlier point, we do actually pin most of the CI. In fact, this morning we had a very broad outage in our CI because everything was pinned to COS 109, which is not even available anymore in GCP, and was probably not intended to be used in the latest release branches. Most of our CI is pinning to particular release branches, and the like cryo no DDEs are a more recent bit of coverage that we've added. I think we will definitely have CI that can cover this, and of the CI we need to run, it's very cheap to have a job run with a kernel config. Like it, we can run some node E2E or something. We're not talking about 5,000 node scale tests or something like that. In kind, we have coverage for this. Selfishly, it would make my life easier if I can point to SIG and just say they deleted it. Cgroups 1 is gone. Don't bother me about this anymore. But I know that we have a lot of users that are still on older distros, and most distros I think are not going to necessarily bump to the latest systemd patch version right off the bat. It'll be some future release version. So I think we want to be careful about the timeline. It does seem like something we'll probably do eventually as there's less and less investment. But if we're already frozen out features, I don't think that getting some CI coverage is going to be a big blocker for it. We have other jobs. And I don't want us to, similar discussion we were just having, we don't want to have a like Docker shim moment. We want to find some kind of balance where we get a good outcome. And I think we really need to dig into the timeline of when do we think it's actually going to be really hard to support. It seems like this is kind of the leading edge still.
Yeah. Now, if we find particular bugs that are like actual Kubernetes bugs, like we changed something and we broke secret v1 support, and it's difficult for us to test it or fix it, like that's useful to know. If we broke a thing, I would expect us to fix it, probably by reverting a change back to what worked before. If we're finding it difficult to test or difficult to develop, that's useful information and could inform, like that would be a more reasonable case for like considering removal. Like we are breaking things, we can't reasonably test it, we can't reasonably fix it. This is a bad state. But if it's just sitting there, I would just leave it, at least for now, until we see more removal in most or all OSs, I guess.
So, yeah, I mean, so yeah, go on through again.
Yeah, I just want to make clear what we're doing here. Like with this cap, we declare that we will remove it and we mark as default false. So like you cannot start kubelet without specifying a flag. And then the plan is in 1 year, like a few releases down the road, we feel that adoption will be big enough, so we will remove the code. And like meanwhile, we'll have some baseline end-to-end tests and it's fine. And Fedora is not the first one. Like in GKE, we announced deprecation already, and we're about to remove ability to run on cgroup v1. I don't know like how public we can be on like when exactly we do it, but definitely soon. So it's very aligned with the timeline of kernels adopting this cgroup v1. And if we will postpone this marking it as deprecated, then like when we decide it's time to deprecate, we need to mark it deprecate and then wait another 2 releases. And like I don't want to be in this situation. I want like when we decide that we are ready to remove it, let's remove it next release. Like we already declared the deprecation. So I think this cap is very reasonable in this regards, and I think it's very good way to make awareness for customers to make it not start by default, so people will start applying this flag.
I think Tim's response in the thread was a good one. Like, if there are no blockers to cgroup v2 adoption, then maybe this is a reasonable step. Like, we're not removing it. You have to explicitly opt back in to use it. cgroup v2 adoption has no blockers. Like the replacement is ready to use. So you should use it. If you want to use cgroup v1, we're not removing it. You need to like opt in explicitly. We've done that with other things like the KMS v1 to v2 switch. We kept KMS v1, but you have to like re-enable it explicitly to keep using the first one. It's deprecated.
But that does break existing users though, right? If they're like on older versions of Kubernetes and they upgrade then it would not work, and then it effectively breaks them. And then they can't undo it, kind of like what System D did. But
needing to tweak a kubelet config on a minor upgrade, we do that sometimes. We do it rarely. We try to only do it for good reasons. But if the point here is to make sure people explicitly know they're opting into a thing which is deprecated, like I said, we did that with KMS v1. So break is, there's different types of break. You do your upgrade to the new version, and presumably you try running the new version before you do it in prod, and it doesn't start, and it gives you an error message that says secret v1 is deprecated. To re-enable, opt in here. Here's the article that tells you what you need to be doing. Like that's a break that we accept. Like you have to set a new field in the config to keep using deprecated behavior. We just want to be super careful about like saying it's going to be gone in a year if we don't actually know it's going to be gone in a year. If what we're doing is starting the deprecation clock and there are no blockers to secret v2, maybe that's a reasonable thing to do, but just deleting secret v2 because one OS dropped it. That's
my goal originally was to set the field to true and announce that we are actually deprecating cgroups v1, because I find the maintenance mode is a little vague. Like we haven't actually deprecated cgroups v1 in the Kubernetes community when like most of our OSs have announced it.
I don't think it's vague. Like it's very explicit actually. It says it's not deprecated. We're not going to add any more features to it.
Yeah, I feel like that was a very intentional decision we made to say this is a way to encourage you to move off, but like not break anyone. And
Yes.
and you know, if GKE is moving off of it and Fedora is moving off of it, that's great. But we also have to think about the long tail of, I mean, as I brought up in the thread, all those local dev tools. It will make my life so much easier for the one I support if I don't have to worry about this. But at the same time, it could have a pretty negative impact on the ecosystem that lots of developers like can't spin up a cluster to toy with K3D, Minikube, kind, whatever, and they need to like overhaul their host OS kernel parameters or upgrade it to a different distro or something. That's pretty disruptive aside from the production clusters. And I'm sure there's a lot of interesting production clusters out there where someone's running a self-managed cluster on Amazon and they're using Amazon Linux 2 that's still supported well into next year, that sort of thing. I think we need to have a better idea that when we're killing it off, that's actually in alignment with very low impact, unless we can point to and say, this is causing really big problems for us to have the old code paths around for the existing feature set. And if it's something like we need to find an OS that has it to run CI, I don't think that's gonna be a problem. I can drop some pointers. We just
I
had
don't
a
think
feature
it's a
for that
problem.
in
I just
Kind.
think like supporting it is a problem. Like we barely can find people to support to onboard 134 on a test lane, like 134 release. Like we just find like Harshin did it like today, and supporting like something that neither like supporting something that we currently don't have OSs for is like supported OSs. Like
So again, by
currently
test lane, you mean
very
node
yeah.
E2E? Because I think like most of the rest of the project is looking at the cluster E2Es, which get really broad coverage. If node E2E needs some help to get this, then I think putting out a call first is a good move. Like I would probably respond to that because I think if that's the only gap, then that's something that I can spend a little bit of time on that really shouldn't be high effort.
So
Yeah,
I guess
about out
we're
of
at
time.
time.
I want to go ahead. We're out of time, but
Yeah, no, so for next steps for me, it sounds like we're not really ready to even announce the deprecation of cgroups v1, and I'll just go ahead and close this issue.
Did you say that, or like I think we?
Well, it just
did our
sounds like are we okay with deprecating? Like, because it sounds like there are still OSs that, like, to be honest, the LTS OSs and the kernel will go probably to about 2030. on supporting C groups v1. So like we could find an OS that is probably still supporting C groups v1.
Although
And
Yeah, there's sort of 3 reasons I would see justifying it. It's unbearably costly, like it's breaking all the time and we can't possibly support it. So if we could just like demonstrate that, capture that information, that would be one rationale. The second rationale is basically all OSs have dropped it. And the third is basically everybody is successfully using C groups v2. And like I don't see any of those described here. This is a big one initially dropped it, so let's drop it. And those other 3 dimensions are what I would expect to see as justification for saying it's deprecated, now we're starting the clock. So if you want to reformulate this with some of those as input, that would probably be my recommendation.
Okay, I mean, I'll see.
Okay.
Those answers are hard for me to answer. Like the open issues on C groups v1, I'm not exactly sure where those fit anymore.
Okay.
But I'll think about it and we can remove it. I mean, we'll see. I'll see what I can do.
Do we have a way to track the, like maybe we should add a label or something so we can get an idea how common those issues are? And I did think it was interesting to maybe dig a little bit further. If you think it's going to be LTS kernel till 2030, then maybe it's not worth looking further at that. But trying to gauge like how soon we think almost everyone won't have this anymore might give us an idea when is a reasonable target.
I think disabling by default was a way to gauge this feedback. People can come back and like depending on how many people scream, it will be easier to understand. But yeah.
All right, we're out of time. I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you all. It's a good discussion.